What I've been more excited about is just like kind of the normalization of like talking to AI. And that I think is like a really good trend for us, where once people are doing this in a context that's not necessarily recruiting for the first time, it makes it a lot easier when you go for one of these interviews to go like understand what's happening. And like we don't have to be the people that normalize that behavior.
Welcome to Smart Speakers. Today we are talking with Varun Khurana, the co-founder of Wayfaster, a startup using voice AI to revolutionize job interviews. If you've ever been rejected from a job without getting a chance to prove yourself, then you're going to love this conversation. Varun shares how they're interviewing thousands of candidates at once, why AI video avatars creep everybody out, me included, and his surprisingly bearish take on consumer voice AI, plus why he hangs up on AI cold calls despite being a voice AI founder himself. Thanks for tuning in. Varun, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
So let's hear the quick elevator pitch for Wayfaster.
Yeah, Wayfaster, started out as a way to interview your entire pipeline in a couple seconds, your entire pipeline of candidates. And the only way you can really do that is using voice AI. And so that's kind of the underpinning part of this. But really, over the last couple months, Wayfaster's been moving towards a company that holistically kind of lets companies actually hire and sort people through their inbound applicants, whether that's through voice AI, through resume filters, automated other reference checks, all these things. And that's kind of where the company's been going.
That's awesome. And are y'all focused on like technical recruiting, or is it a specific kind of role?
Yeah, I like to say like one of the differentiators of our product is just that we built a system that can scale up from, a warehouse worker all the way to a software mid-level software engineer. So we actually kind of run the gauntlet on the types of interviews that we do.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna double click on that. I can't believe I just said double click. It feels like a very corporate thing, but we're just gonna let it ride. And we're gonna let the commentary ride. We like to ask folks when they come on the show what their first like big aha moment is with AI. So it doesn't have to be voice AI, but like would love to hear about you and like when there was that spark in your brain about interacting with these things.
Yeah, it's funny. I had like maybe an early look at, I think it was called GPT Playground like many years ago. And I remember I was working at this company called Pioneer, which was started by this guy, Dan Gross. I remember looking at GPT Playground because I think they were kind of tinkering with some of the cutting edge of that stuff. I think it was like maybe 2019, which feels, maybe I'm getting my memory wrong, but I remember like at some point I saw GPT Playground and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. But I think the first thing for me was we were a couple months into starting the company, and I think SPC, where we kind of incubated the company, their whole ethos is like, find what you want to do and make sure that it's something you're passionate about. So you spend a couple months in the wilderness, just like working on some of the worst ideas you've ever heard, talk to people, like reading. And we had these Tegus memberships, and Tegus, for those people who don't know, is just like an expert network where you can kind of read. It's transcribed these expert calls where like you'll go get on the phone with like the CEO of like ex CEO of like Southwest, and like it's usually like an investor on the other side. Tegus's whole model is, instead of keeping that conversation on the phone, like they'll transcribe it and put it in a library. And, when you're reading these things, it usually takes like 45 minutes to read it. And there's a lot of really interesting insights in there. And I remember my first AI moment was like, it would take me 45 minutes to read it. I just threw it in like GPT-3, like the week or two it came out. And it just like transcribed and gave me like a pretty good summary of like what was going on. And I was like, very interesting. Like this AI thing is definitely going to be a thing, just for the very reason that like I worked on a strategy team and I worked with a bunch of ex consultants, and they would send me these like long convoluted documents that were saying fucking nothing. And I was like, I could have done this job in maybe 15 minutes a day if I didn't have to sit there and read to figure out like what the like actual nuggets in here were. So I was like, oh, this thing's gonna be huge, even if it's just for summarization. And obviously we know like some of the things have kind of gone from there.
That's awesome. Great use case for it, for sure. And yeah, I definitely empathize with like if I could have applied GPT summarization to the emails I get from my kids' schools, I can find the action item that's like buried in paragraph 17. I still have yet to like actually do this, but like sometimes, I mean, it still comes up. There's like, yeah, like I guess I've missed the permission slip because it was literally like in the 18th paragraph out of 36 in like a weekly email that I get.
Yeah.
It's like, how am I supposed to find this stuff?
It's good your kids are asking you for permission slips. I used to forge mine all the time when I was in.
Yeah, my kid's really proactive. So, she's really on top of the action items more than I am. Let's hear a little bit about your career. So you said you worked in consulting or strategy?
When I post-graduating school, I went to go work for a company called TransferWise, which was based out of Europe, and I did a bunch of stuff around growth and analytics. It was a very interesting time in TransferWise's history. It's like the company scaled almost like 4 or 5x over the course of a year. So I ended up, with 2 or 3 different bosses, like doing a bunch of different things across the org. So I did that for a year, ish, and then spent a couple of months at a company called Pioneer, which built like, this like finding the best talent in the world incubator. And then the majority of my time at Instacart. So I joined Instacart right around as COVID was starting. So it was a really interesting look at really the highs of working at a hypergrowth startup. And then like, we were also on the other end of that where there was like quite a steep fall the second year I was there. And a lot changed about the org. And then I think that like it was pretty clear to me like I didn't want to be working at a 5,000 person company just because of the pace. I think was a little slow. I teamed up with my co-founder Trey. We started exploring ideas like late 2022, maybe early 2023, and raised the pre-seed from South Park Commons, and we're off to the races.
So when you teamed up with your co-founder, was it like just the explicit goal was I want to start a company, or were you thinking like I want to start a company in this space? Or yeah, what was like the motivation there?
We, I think, didn't have any intention of starting a company in the recruiting space. I think for us, we just really wanted to start a company. I think we'd been talking about it for 4 or 5 years at that point. Like the timing was both right, where we were both at the tail end of hypergrowth companies that had kind of stagnated. And we just really liked working together. And I think like the nice thing about Trey and I is like even to this day, like we have no shortage of ideas, which I think gives us like a
That's
good
awesome.
like even this weekend we were just riffing of like I was telling Trey, I was like, dude, I think we should start like an energy drink company. And here's like 6 energy drink ideas I have. And like, we're never going to seriously, deviate away from what we're doing. But I think like we just felt like there was a lot of excitement and there's no shortage of ideas that we could work on. And so we kind of felt pretty confident just like diving into that journey.
Got it. That's cool.
Sounds like an awesome partnership.
So then you had time to explore with South Park Commons. How did you go from like this kind of kernel of like we just want to start something to Wayfaster?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, guys, it was like a lot of bad ideas over the course of the year. So we went through it.
I'm very familiar with that. I like Dave and I are
Yeah.
working through them right now.
I think there was some where, maybe they were worth sticking out and we just, maybe timed it wrong or like we just didn't have the right approach to what was actually a pretty sizable problem. So, there was one where we worked on like CPG deductions, which is just like reconciliation between like a retailer and a CPG brand and making sure that they're not overcharging you for some of the things you can get docked with as a brand, like, not having enough inventory, all these things that they apply to the bottom line. So that was an interesting one. One other interesting one we worked on with a couple big funds was like essentially a way to make like these private investment firms like growth equity investment banks like a way to make them like AI first in the way that they segmented and built their workflows around documentation. So financial firms are really unique in the fact that everything sits over email and there's a lot of documents back and forth, but there's no like system of record because things move so fast that you kind of are like, we're going to have the most efficient way of communicating possible. And then like we're never gonna do like project management or like try to summarize everything that happened post app like after the deal was done. Owens were like a really interesting use case of like, can you self-organize everything that's happening on at a financial firm? Because clearly the humans don't have the time to do it, but all this information sits there on text in certain channels.
That's
And so
interesting.
for us, like we worked on that for a while. And to their credit, like Rogo, like absolutely nailed it. And like we never really got super far with it. And then we worked on like just some like really bad ideas where we were like Datadog, cost reduction, and then like help SaaS companies go international in a box. Like there was just, some were good, some were bad. But I think, that was kind of a year of exploration for us.
At some point, I mean, you don't have to choose one, but at some point you do. If you want to make a company, you have to like stop making other ideas?
Wayfaster was a very thesis-driven company in the sense that we had both spent a decent amount of time interviewing in our lives. Being in your 20s and interviewing a lot at hypergrowth companies, you don't really actually understand fully what you're asking, especially when you're doing 6, 8, 10 interviews a week. Like, there's no standardization framework. I remember I wrote the case study for BizOps and strategy at Instacart when we hired like 20, 30 people. And it was just like something I just made up while I was on the beach in Hawaii.
I'm sure it was really good.
It's definitely not still being used today.
I hope not. But I think the interesting thing for us was like we noticed two things. One is that these foundation models are getting a lot smarter, and then the second is that text-to-speech latencies are dropping really, really fast. And Troy had been the first engineer at DeepGram, which was like a pioneer in the at the time speech to text. They're now text to speech as well. But we had an early look at like this is something that was happening. Simultaneously, actually, my roommate at the time was working on a voice AI product that he even beat me up there like 6 or 7 months earlier, and it's now doing really well. It's called SuperDial. But we saw this voice thing happening. We had this problem that we'd experienced firsthand. Like I think a lot of the solutions that we initially thought of were like, can you build a better skills assessment or can you build a better hacker rank? And then when you start to think about wholesale, what's a 10x solution to a better skills assessment? That's when we started to put the pieces together and we launched really quickly. Got some really positive feedback after launch, signed a couple early pilots, and I think like from there it was like pretty clear to us that we were onto something. I think at the tail end, maybe as a first time founder of like a year of exploration, you're just desperately searching for something that would work. And for us, it was pretty clear that we had a strong thesis plus some early traction. And I think you put those two together, and it's like pretty easy bet to make.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Tell us about the path of the product and the path of the company in terms of how the product has changed and how it's grown over the time you've been working on it.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. The first version of the product was just something where we would just have someone essentially come in and talk to GPT for like 20 minutes, right? And then you just like add some like text to speech on top of it. And it was very basic, but I think people were wowed by, just like how in depth GPT could go before it broke on some of these conversations. As we kind of started to build out the product, like there's a couple things that have to be done in interviews and like one of the hardest problems with something like this is like creating the interface for what questions that a company needs to cover and then standardizing these during the course of the interview. And so for us, like that's been the biggest challenge is like from a hiring manager, recruiter's inputs or like whatever inputs they give us, can we structure a list of topics? And then from there, can we ensure that we're, delivering those topics over the course of the conversation while still maintaining that like dynamicness of like, what's going on in the interview. So that's been a real hard challenge. I think the other things that are pretty hard about interviewing fully autonomously is just that like you have to pull out an amount of metadata for this to be useful. And then you also have to ensure that companies trust that metadata so that they don't have to sit there and watch every interview because that takes away the entire point of doing it, right? So you have to like kind of have some scoring system, some like these are the outputs we're pulling out of every interview, which allows you to be like, cool, like this isn't a fit for us. Like these sorts of things that are shortcuts for whoever's reviewing the interview. I would also add a third, especially earlier on in the company, was just like, how do you have a voice agent hold up for 30 minutes talking about like a list of these topics and whatnot across thousands of calls? And I think, just naturally over the course of time, like that's gotten a little better with just voice agent infrastructure. And there's all these testing tools and all this stuff on the market now, but 6 months ago, it wasn't an easy problem to solve.
So 6 months ago, when it was a little bit more rough, were there certain roles where your product was like really resonating with recruiters, or was it pretty wide at that point?
Early on, it was like things in like the hospitality, warehousing, these like very, very blue collar roles, customer support. Funnily, one of our earliest target segments was like the BPO market. And then like we very quickly, it was great for early product feedback, but very quickly you realize like this market's about to get like destroyed by like the very technology that you're trying to sell to them. So I think those were the first initial entry points were just like super high volume. Can you do 5 or 10 quick calls. Increasingly, we've just been like, I think this is an inevitability across jobs, all the way up to like the mid-career level. And I can kind of discuss the underlying trends around that. And so we've started to think more about like these more white collar type jobs, though we do continue to serve the lower end of the market as well.
We had someone on the podcast a week ago who was talking about how, it can be very quick to generate a proof of concept, but then actually gaining trust with customers, that's a lot harder. And you were sort of alluding to that with like, can you trust the metadata? Like how with these sort of like more technically challenging roles, how are you doing that? How are you convincing folks to use you?
Yeah, I mean, jury's still out. Candidly, guys, if we're gonna be able to do it
Yeah,
at scale, right? Like, it's not like we're Cursor and like every recruiter in the world is using us already.
yeah.
The one thing has interestingly been that's been helpful is like moving beyond voice in a funny way, which is like a lot of the time our entry points into the organization, especially when it comes to corporates, is like, let's try a lighter weight version of this where we're going to use it to help screen subset of inbound applications. And then like we transition them into voice slowly over time. Because they can see the value prop, but I think we're very determined to solve this like broader problem of like just like recruiters have given up on inbound applications and like companies just have as a whole. And I think we're like, cool, like we'll use a different entry point that's not necessarily voice. And then like once you see and can trust us to do that thing, we can take that next step. And it's all about building customer trust. HR recruiting has traditionally been a very risk averse part of like the buyer market. And one of the biggest things is just having close relationship with customers and having them trust you.
What about the candidate response? Like, has it been uniform across different roles? Have people kind of been like, hey, am I talking to an AI? Do they know they're going to talk to an AI?
We tend to be pretty upfront that,
Yeah.
people are talking to AI. We tried avatars and every candidate hated it because, I see some of our competitors trying to like force these cartoon or realistic looking avatars. And, I think it just makes candidates feel dumb. It's just like, why am I talking to an avatar? Like, how stupid do you think I am? Like, I, I think the candidate experience has actually been really, really good. You have this interesting thing going on right now with many applications. Candidates have just gotten really accustomed to like getting this like default auto reject email from an ATS, right? Which is like, hey, like you're not a fit for this job, blah blah blah. And like it really feels like you're not really given a chance to prove your skills for the job. At the least like 20, 30 years ago, you'd have an interview. Maybe it went well, maybe it didn't, but you were given the opportunity to kind of do this. I think right now candidates really like these interviews because they feel like at least I'm being given a shot to prove my skills and show them
That's
what I
really
can
interesting.
do, as opposed to like getting an auto reject email. And I think it's not a perfect experience. Like at the end of the day, like we're fully cognizant of the fact that like you'd rather talk to the hiring manager of a job, but a lot of the times like it's better than the default that was happening before us. I will also add that most first round recruiter screens, I don't know, you guys seem like you've been entrepreneurs for a while, but if you've ever done them, like I don't really think that there's a lot happening in there where you're like, oh, I really missed that human touch of like the recruiter asking me my compensation expectations for 10 minutes. Like recruiters have a huge role, but like I don't think like first round, second round phone screen is like really where they're like really excelling at selling the company, selling the role. Like those things all come kind of down the line from that initial touch point with the candidate.
You're saying that candidates like it because the scarce resource before was like human attention on the recruiter or the company side. And if they, because like humans have so little attention, like I remember posting a job at Spotify, we had like 1,000 applicants. There's like no way, just like zero chance that all those, that I could look at every single one of those resumes. But if you give like, you add some automation to that, you actually give more people a shot at demonstrating that they are the right fit.
Yeah, I would segment it into two parts, right? Like the recruiter side is quite literally like you in that case, like you're not getting through 1,000 applications, even if it takes you 7 seconds to read a resume and you do it at hyper speed, like you're just not going to do it, right? It's impossible. I think from the candidate side, like I would just boil it down to like my default is I'm going to get an auto reject email. At least here, I know that if I do a good job on the interview, I have a shot at this opportunity, and it's very much so, right? Like we're telling people who the best person is, not necessarily giving them a dump of a resume. And then I think the other big thing for them is just that like it's in a way a time saver over doing these first round interviews that might not go there anywhere. You have to schedule your time, you have to sit there, you have to look all pretty, and then all to tell them like, oh, you're beyond this compensation range. Like, why not just get this put out of the way? I don't have to schedule it. It saves a bunch of my time. I can take it whenever I want. And so I think those are the two sides of this thing. There's the recruiter and the candidate side, and we hopefully are providing clear benefit to both.
You had mentioned the difficulty of getting a voice agent to like capture all the metadata that you're looking for. Would love to hear about your kind of like iterations on that problem, because it's a big problem even for a 5-minute call, let alone like a
Yeah.
30-minute call.
Yeah, I think for us, like the nice thing about interviewing is that it's high stakes and low stakes in the sense that it's high stakes for everyone involved, like having an employer brand, like the candidate, is like the candidate cares about the interview immensely. But I think it's low stakes in the sense that if you have like a 90% uptime versus 99% uptime, it's like, cool, like let's try to resend this link over. Let's try to do this again. It's kind of like recording a podcast, right? Like you guys were like, hey, like we can re-record anything, right? And I think an interview is the same way in that like there's no loss of revenue if something fails. Like I know in healthcare, like some of these prior authorization voice bots and stuff, like you're not able to make that call, it doesn't work, you're like, oh no, like now I have lost money, right? There's like a very clear outcome. And so I think for us, we've always just taken the approach of like, what's the best thing we can kind of do to make sure that this works and like delivers a great experience. And then like we took the trade-off of that instead of reliability early on.
So when it works really well, but it might not work all the time.
Exactly. And that was the early approach to what we were doing. And I know there was other companies out there that, for certain other use cases, not necessarily interviewing, would like back up, their voice agents with like a BPO, for example, right? Where you could ensure that 100% calls got completed. We've always just taken the approach of like, let's deliver the best possible experience. And if, it comes at the expense of reliability, candidly, maybe in the first 6 months of the company, that was a mistake. And I think over time, we've just tried to migrate to like more robust infrastructure. And my co-founder, Shrey, has been doing voice AI stuff for many, many years now. And so I think we are always we have some homegrown stuff, but I will always say that like the infrastructure market's moving so fast that you always just want to keep an eye out for who the best vendor is, whether that's like middleware, text-to-speech providers, right? Like we started off on Vapey and then like we've slowly moved off them. We were using, I think, not 11 early on. We were using a different text-to-speech provider, I think maybe like PlayHT. And now like we use a variety of text-to-speech vendors depending on if we're optimizing for cost or speed. So I think it's really, as a voice AI founder, the biggest thing is just like keeping an eye out on like what's the best next vendor, and then like kind of adapting to that really, really fast, more than anything.
So I guess like zooming out a bit, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that you're kind of like looking at other areas of the recruiter workflow. We had someone on recently, Olivia Moore from A16Z, who was talking about how like she views voice as a good hook, but it's not like the whole product. And it seems like you're kind of seeing that too. So are you thinking more broadly now about how AI is changing a recruiter's role? Like what's your view on that? How are you addressing it?
I will give you my view on the recruiting market and how AI is transforming it. It actually starts with the candidate side, right? The narrative we tell recruiters is it's so easy to apply for a job these days, and it's only going to get easier. And the way recruiters have kind of skirted around that recently is like, cool, we're just going to give up on inbound and we're just going to go source all the candidates, right? Like from like your like junior level software engineer, like they're sourcing for like intern programs these days, which is like crazy because it's like,
That's wild.
what are you
Yeah.
sourcing? You can imagine a world that's coming 6 months from now, right? Like these things tend to hit equilibrium where like all the candidates are getting inundated with all the recruiters who've decided to take this very same strategy of like, we're going to go outbound and try to source all these candidates. Like my co-founder, who's been working at this company for 2 years, still gets like 20 messages a week from recruiters asking him if he wants to go work at insert Series A company. Like we're just like spraying and praying on the other side of things as well. And I think what's that leaves is just like you need to find a way to filter this inbound in the best way possible. And I think it doesn't fully make sense all the time to give a voice AI assessment to everyone, right? Like you want a first layer of like an accountant applies for a software engineering job. Like why would he take a voice AI interview? Then you have to review that, right? So you probably want some layer of like give an assessment to this layer of people. Even amongst that, you want to be like, here's the people where I just need like their compensation information and when they're available. There's other parts of people you want to try out, like, hey, are they a good software engineer or not? Like for an entry level role, like you need to have that as an earlier filter as opposed to someone with 7 years of Google on their resume. So you can think of inbound recruiting as this thing that's going to come back in vogue, and then you're going to need this huge decision tree of like which candidates get what type of filtering, right? And for us, like that's a really interesting decision, like problem to solve, which is like voice is definitely going to be a component of that. And I think that, especially the lower entry level roles to the mid level roles where it's just a complete inability to tell who's good or not, like that's probably true. You can also imagine a world where like if you're any corporate organization, you have a bunch of mid-level software engineers who aren't going to take a voice AI screen no matter how compelling it is, right? And so it's very much for us creating that decision tree for like filtering inbound applications and making that a viable channel for organizations today. And I think that's what we've been going out as we've moved more corporate and telling people.
Do you view that decision tree as something that companies are going to need or maybe want control over, or do you view it as something that you all are going to be able to dial in with, like the AI essentially making the judgment call?
Yeah, recruiting is an interesting thing because it's a two-party game, right? Which makes it a like you're never gonna hit like the trajectory curve of revenue as like a single player game like Cursor or Gamma, right? It's two parties always involved, right? Does the candidate want to work here, or does the recruiter want the candidate as well? I think what's going to get really really good is the part of like can the recruiters identify the best candidate for the role, and I think AI is going to have a huge role on that in terms of just like these AI interviews, like whatever information they can provide on text prior to applying, and we're going to get really good at that. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve the second part of the equation, right? Which is like what can you tell to the candidate that's going to make them want to work here? And that I think is not really going to be replaced with AI. There's still this role of selling the candidate. You can make the argument that that might increasingly fall to the hiring manager or like someone who's given this list of 10 great candidates and then they go and do the selling. But for the foreseeable future, like that two-sided relationship exists and AI might really help with one part of it, which is what we're aiming to do. Other half, we'll see. I don't think that people are going to like being sold by AI about the role. I think is really an issue.
Makes a ton of sense.
I always draw parallels between recruiting and dating, right? It's like there's you want to have a match. You need both sides to be interested in order for there to be a match, and it doesn't matter how well it went up to that point if only one side is interested. At the end of the day, it's like just not going to happen, right? So like
I've been recruiting Sydney Sweeney for years, but it doesn't seem like this job's going to be
I
a
don't know.
fairly
With Wayfaster, you could have gotten it done by now, man. You could have already had it done. I think there's like, there might be some other issues in the pipeline there, but we'll save that for a different show. What are you excited about that's coming down the pipe for Wayfaster?
I think there's two things that really excite us. One is just like the continued momentum of how good we're getting at interviewing and like how autonomously can run to the point that we're now just going almost close to full self-serve where anyone can just like come in with a job description, a little bit about the role and go to interview 1,000 every single person in their pipeline. And so that's one thing that's really exciting for us. There's less and less hand holding every time we have to onboarding new customer now, which is very exciting. The second is just like I mentioned, like kind of taking a more ambitious view of like the problem we're solving. I think if you're selling like AI in sales or like AI in I don't know, like home care. I don't know what people are doing these days, but it's easy to prove the ROI for us. I think what's harder is to convince people that this seismic behavioral shift is happening, right? Where candidates are going to be comfortable taking these interviews and, our data shows they are, but there's still like a little bit of like see it till you believe it. And what I've been more excited about is just like kind of the normalization of like talking to AI. And that I think is like a really good trend for us, where once people are doing this in a context that's not necessarily recruiting for the first time, it makes it a lot easier when you go for one of these interviews to go like understand what's happening. And like we don't have to be the people that normalize that behavior.
Yeah. Have you been cold called by an AI yet?
I have, yes, actually. It's kind of shitty, but I just hung up.
Yeah, it's not a lot of solidarity there.
Yeah, come on, don't you want to help that startup prove their ROI to their enterprise corporate customer?
They were like, "Do you want unemployment insurance?" I was like, "Well, no, I'm full gainfully employed. Thank you."
Yeah, way to start the call, AI.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe so some bad targeting. They just got to rev on the parameters. It's fine. We've been working on voice AI for months now, and it's still, I'm not sure that I've encountered something that was like
I don't
obviously
think I
voice
have.
AI in the wild.
Yeah. But you
Maybe
figure it
spam,
will
but yeah,
happen, right?
it
Like you're
has to
saying, like
happen.
it's going to be ubiquitous soon. And maybe in certain niches it like totally is ubiquitous. Like we hear that a lot of B2B healthcare use cases are like totally dominated by voice AI now.
Yeah, maybe voice AI on both sides already,
Yeah.
right? In some cases.
Yeah, it's been interesting because I think like this is gonna be surprising to hear from a voice AI founder, but I'm actually a little more bearish on like the consumer voice
Interesting.
AI use cases. Like I like voice AI in like what I call constrained environments. Like B2B, there's like an amount of intent, like when you call like a receptionist or like interview, right? Where it's very constrained, what you're coming in for an interview, you're going to be talking to this AI, all these things. Maybe Olivia had a much better, she's much smarter than I am, but she, I think like A16Z has been putting out a lot of stuff around like the consumer use case of voice. Like, will you be talking to your ChatGPT and like, these foundation models and all that stuff on like a day-to-day basis. And I am actually a little more bearish on that. I think there's like a real like reason why text works as like asynchronous conversation and like day-to-day life. Like I know like AirPods and stuff make it like less weird to be talking to your phone, but maybe it's a world I don't want to exist in, where it's like we're talking to like our phones all the time when we're like outside or like in the car or whatever. But I'm actually like a little more bearish on the consumer use case. But I think voice is going to be huge. Like where I think people are going to like encounter this at least in some capacity when it's talking to their doctor's office or like, you know, their receptionist or like making a restaurant reservation or something like that in the very, very near future.
Yeah, I think my experience on the consumer side is that, like, for whatever reason, I'm sure there's a reason, and hopefully we can get them on to talk about it. Like, ChatGPT in voice mode is like way worse. You could like almost give it, I haven't tried this to A/B test it, like give it the same prompt, and somehow it gives you like a worse answer over voice. It's like, that's not a great experience. I am a weird person that loves to talk. I wish I could talk to my computer more.
Oh, really?
We've been prototyping this kind of like personal health app where we, built in some voice stuff with the expectation that people would want to talk to it. And so far, with our very, very, very small like N of like 20 something people, most people don't really want to talk to it. They'd rather just text it.
I'd rather text
Right.
it. Yeah.
Which like makes sense, right? Like, because most of the time, like most of the trend of the consumer internet has been away from getting on the phone and more towards like the instant gratification of the button click or the text, right? But I'm curious how it'll end up, what equilibrium will end up at, where part of the reason we moved away from voice is because that it like sucked and you had to wait on hold and like whatever voice system you get on the other end was like an IVR and you had to like go through a menu. So it just like was a like considerably shittier experience than texting or emailing or using a website. But now that the voice systems are actually have some intelligence behind them, that's not only if you get lucky enough to have a human intelligence, then maybe that'll change, but maybe not. Maybe like the habit's already gone, especially for folks that are younger than me. So it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting future regardless, but curious where the equilibrium will be.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because it's like one of the things that I always try to keep in mind, and like I feel like maybe we're a little far apart in age, not that far apart. You guys still look very young.
Yeah, very young. Thank you. For everyone watching on video, we were very young.
We're
Yeah.
You
just a
mentioned
year
hot or
older than
not,
you.
and
Yeah.
I was just like, I've heard stories.
I mentioned Hot or Not, which is a website that it stopped existing like 20 years ago. So I must be like a certain age. Yeah.
Dave was 8 when he worked at Hot or Not, so
Yeah, I mean, I was
it all
really
adds up.
precocious and certainly was legal, no, not violating any like child labor laws. Anyway,
The reason I bring that up is just like always try to keep this in the back of my mind, which is like there's always a generation of people that are gonna grow up on these tools as opposed to like it being a behavior shift. And like
Right.
maybe it feels weird for me like having texted and like talking to people in like my whole life that like it feels weird to do something like talking to your phone all the time. But I always try to keep in mind like there's some 7-year-old out there that's been doing
Yeah.
this their whole life and like maybe the behavior shifts don't come from like a switch of people's existing behaviors, which is always harder than just like someone who grows up on these things. And like when I think about these adoption curves and all this stuff, like it's something that I try to keep in my back of my head like
So yeah, Dave and I have kids, 8 and 10, around that age. Which is strange because we're only 25 years old.
yeah,
Like when we watch,
precocious, really precocious.
yeah, I don't know how it happened, but
Yeah.
they want to talk to everything, which is honestly like the most annoying thing because you'll be like at dinner and they'll be like, "Hey, Alexa," now Alexa's gonna go. Like what's the capital of I don't know, Uzbekistan? Like they'll just be like doing that during dinner. They want to talk to everything. So yeah, maybe it'll even out that way or just kind of like change with the generational shift.
One way to look at the adoption of different social apps is just like who was like 17 at the time the thing got popular. And like Facebook is one version of that. And like Insta was another version of that. And Snap was a different version of that. Like TikTok is another version of that. And I think there's some exceptions to this. Like for productivity, it might be different. Like I've been vibe coding for a couple weeks or whatever. And holy shit, like I never want to write a line of code by hand again. It's like so much better to just be vibe coding. And so I'm just going to be like with my cursor. I want to build like a voice interface to cursor. Yeah, my kids, it's opened up creating with computers in a totally different way. And so like, yeah, I think it's a great question to ask. Like, what is the 9-year-old or 11-year-old of today? What's their preferred mode of communication going to be with the computer? Because they already assume that like any screen is touchable, right? Which is like, oh, you have to, you're telling me like this screen, I can't like pinch to zoom. Like really? Like why would there be a screen that you can't pinch to zoom on? That's dumb, right? So they're going to have a totally different set of expectations, which I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be a weird world, but it's going to be fun to see what they do with it.
it's I don't know, man. I think with AI, the thing I wake up and feel is like things are about to get weird, and it's weird.
Super weird.
I live in New York, and most of my friends are in finance, and like I have a friend whose company, like up until last year, was using Skype, and I was like, dude,
You don't know how
like
weird it's gonna get. They don't know.
They have no idea.
I have no idea. It's like I think it's like you hear. It's funny you don't put the like thing about like adoption curves being uneven until like early adopters and laggards and all this stuff until like you grow up and you actually see how
And so you're not in the early adopter bucket anymore, right? We love to ask folks like if you have any content you've been loving, like books, articles, podcasts, TV, or whatever that you'd like to recommend to folks as we wrap up.
This is a good question. Unfortunately, guys, I've spent a decent chunk of my last month at conferences, which doesn't leave you a lot of
So you
content.
recommend recruiting conferences as your content?
Sam Lesson over at Slow Lev led our last round, and him and Yoni have been posting a lot of like I think like very like counter counterintuitive takes on like where AI is going. And I will say I will plug my friend Charles's newsletter. It's Charles Rubenfeld. He loves to write about like the second order effects of things, and I think with AI, it's very increasingly interesting to hear. And every time I get his newsletter, I do think a little bit of like, that's weird. Like, what is the second order effect of like high stablecoin adoption? Like, we know it's going to happen, and like this is the immediate effect. Or like when Ozempic becomes widespread, what happens to the fast food industry and all these things? And it's almost like a really great insight into like how an investor or like a hedge fund investor might think about these things in a way that's not very openly published. And so I really love getting his newsletter every week and reading it. And it's always a good 15 minutes of my week.
That's awesome. And where can folks find you and Wayfaster on the internet?
Yeah. First of all, everyone listening to this podcast should immediately book a demo for all their portfolio companies and themselves. And so you can just email me at varun@wayfaster.com or click the demo button on our website. Yeah, but you can just find me on varun@wayfaster.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, I'm sure.
Okay, we'll drop the link in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right, Varun. Thanks so much for coming on the show, man. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, dude.